Hello everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Just Connect English podcast. If you listened to the first two episodes that I released last week and decided to return for more this week, then welcome back. If you haven't listened to the previous podcasts, then I will briefly explain why I am making this podcast, but I recommend going back and listening at least to the first podcast. My name is Graham Byrne, and I have been an English teacher for 9 years. I'm from Ireland, but at the moment I am in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It's a bit of a long story, but long story short, it's because of the coronavirus pandemic. That expression I used, long story short, is one which we use to indicate that I am skipping unnecessary details and getting to the main point. So, we say, long story short, I am in Buenos Aires at the moment due to the coronavirus pandemic. Maybe in the future, I will make a podcast specifically about my current situation, but we don't have time for that right now. If you are listening to this podcast, you are probably learning English, and as I am also a language learner, French and Spanish in my case, I find that podcasts are very useful. As they are usually entirely audio, you can put a podcast on when you're traveling to work, in the gym, or cleaning the house without worrying that you're missing some visual context, like when watching Netflix or a YouTube video. Also, in the last few years, there has been a bit of a podcast revolution with many more people both listening to and making podcasts. Now you can listen to all sorts of podcasts. Podcasts about sports, politics, celebrity culture, philosophy, science, technology, whatever you want. But the problem is that for someone learning English, many English language podcasts can be very difficult as the creators are usually targeting people who are native or fluent speakers. So while there are many podcast options available, the number which English learners can listen to is greatly reduced. There are other podcasts for learning English, but many of them focus on grammar or the same boring topics which appear again and again in English textbooks. In this podcast, I want to talk to you about interesting subjects and help bridge the gap so that in the future you can go on to podcasts and other English language media which is targeted at native and fluent speakers. This was part of my method for learning French, and I am doing the same in Spanish, and with some time and dedication, it works really well. In this podcast, we aren't going to focus on grammar. If there is any area of English you want to focus on, you can contact me for private classes through my website, www.justconnectenglish.com, and I can help you with whatever problems you have. But here, on this podcast, you just have to listen and try to understand what I tell you. I explain my reasons for this in the first episode of the podcast, which is called Learn How to Speak English Naturally. I would also advise you to listen to each episode of this podcast 2 or 3 times in order to understand. Each time you listen, you understand more and more. At first, it's normal not to understand everything. You need several listens to understand everything I say. Also, there is a free transcript on my website, justconnectenglish.com, which will help you with any parts of the podcast that you don't understand. Now for the main topic of the podcast. Today, I want to talk to you about storytelling, which is the activity of telling or writing stories. The reason I chose this topic is because it seems like stories are everywhere we look. We live in a time where we listen to podcasts on the way to work, read the news at our desks, then go home in the evening to watch TV or Netflix on the couch. Not only do we spend all day consuming stories, but we're also constantly creating them. Storytelling is a crucial part of our social selves, whether it's a child making up an excuse for not doing their homework, co-workers gossiping about a friend, writing an email, or even writing a novel. Stories are as important to us as eating and sleeping. The author Philip Pullman says that stories are the most important thing in the world. Without stories, we wouldn't be human beings at all. The importance of stories is why I decided this week to take a closer look at how a good story is created. Today's podcast will show you how stories manipulate the human brain into feeling strong emotions, connecting with characters, and staying hooked all the way to the end. For this podcast, I was particularly inspired by the book The Science of Storytelling by journalist and novelist Will Storr. So first of all, have you ever wondered if what you experience as real is in fact just a powerful simulation? While we probably don't live in a simulated world like the one in the movie The Matrix, you may be surprised to learn that objective reality is impossible for us to see. The reality we experience is just a story that our brain tells us. For example, you see your friend in the street, but when you get closer to her, you realize that it's a stranger, someone you don't know, but you didn't just imagine that you saw her. For a moment, you actually did, as your brain took the information available to it and tried to make sense of it. From a distance, it seemed reasonable to your brain that the stranger was actually your friend, and it only corrected itself when you got closer and more accurate information became available to it. Our brain creates a narrative of reality, and it casts us as the hero. To do this, the brain will rearrange our past choices to fit a heroic narrative. For example, your brain will tell you that it is okay to steal one of your brother's French fries because you believe that he got more than you, and it's only fair that you get the same amount. Our brain also wants to order our lives into sequences of cause and effect in order to explain why something happened, because if there is one thing that the brain cannot accept, it is that an action has no meaning. The brain will even find cause and effect where it doesn't exist. At the beginning of the 20th century, two Soviet filmmakers created a series of films. Each of these films first showed an actor's expressionless face, followed by an unconnected image. In one film, the actor is looking at a bowl of soup, and in another film, the same clip of the actor is shown, except this time he is looking at a soldier in uniform. When an audience were shown the first film, they admired the man's thoughtful look over the soup, while the audience watching the second movie admired his sadness at seeing his son preparing to go to war. There was no explicit connection between the two clips other than being placed together in the same film, but the brains of the people in the audience created a connection between them. The brain is always creating stories, and the story it creates includes us, the hero, but it also includes other characters. We're surrounded by other people, and one of our strongest desires is to understand how their minds work. It's one of the ways our brains tries to control our environment. But why do we have this desire to understand other people? The answer is survival. Humans have survived for so long because of cooperation, and when we started living in towns and cities, having social skills for trading and negotiation became very valuable. In humans of all ages, the desire to understand the minds of others is strong, and stories gives us an opportunity to satisfy this desire. And there's a particular type of character that we are interested in. A character with flaws, someone who is not perfect. As I mentioned, our brains decide that we are the heroes of our stories, creating a narrative in which we are always morally superior. As a result, we can ignore our own faults or flaws. However, as we enter the mind of a flawed character in a story, a safe space is created for exploring our flaws. Many flaws can be traced back to beliefs formed and solidified when we were very young. These help create our unique vision of how the world works. Cultural influences play a major part in this. For example, a character growing up in the wild American West would be influenced by ideas about personal freedom and individual ambition. But a character growing up during the Second World War would be influenced by ideas about personal sacrifice and an understanding that they are part of something much bigger. Once these beliefs from childhood and adolescence are solidified, we spend our entire lives defending them. Opposing views of the world are so unpleasant to us that something which challenges our view of the world feels the same as being physically attacked. We cling to our flawed beliefs, and characters do too. The difference is that while your brain won't let you see your flaws in order to cast you as a hero, it doesn't do the same for others. You notice another person's flaws quicker than you recognize your own, which makes it easier to see the faults and flaws of the character in a story. One of the ways character flaws become clear is in how they help or prevent the character from achieving their goals. As humans, we need meaningful and controllable goals. As a result, we enjoy reading about characters who act towards their goals. However, just as our flaws may prevent us from achieving our goals, the flaws of a well-written character will inevitably make their journey more difficult. Therefore, choosing the character's flaws is an important part of the recipe for creating an interesting character. A good comparison is the difference between Batman and Superman. Whereas Superman is almost flawless to the point that his creators had to introduce the external weakness of kryptonite to prevent him from easily defeating his enemies every time, Batman is deeply affected by witnessing the violent murder of his parents when he was a child. His subsequent decision to fight crime and to protect innocent people as Batman is similar to Superman's goal, but the trauma of losing his parents often creates obstacles to him achieving his goals. So, While our brains would like to cast us as the flawless Superman, it's the more troubled character of Batman and his story that we are interested in reading and watching, as we can explore Batman's flaws and faults without threatening our own view of the world. A good story idea is important, but a truly stimulating plot flows from a well-drawn character. A character with flaws, personality quirks, and a unique worldview that will cause them to act in interesting ways. For example, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein explores Victor Frankenstein's excessive curiosity and irresponsibility. He rejects his creation because of its hideous appearance, and this rejection is the cause for much of the action in the story. When we speak about a flawed character, we're mostly referring to the character's flawed theory of control, or the way they believe they must act in order for the world around them to stay stable. A character's theory of control is tested when confronted with unanticipated change in their situation. Beyond the theory of control, personality is another key element of a well-drawn character. Personality comprises 5 main categories: conscientiousness, neuroticism, openness, agreeableness, and extraversion. A character can score anywhere on the spectrum from low to high for each of these traits, and this combination can help determine what kind of choices they will make and how they react to their circumstances. For example, someone high in both conscientiousness and neuroticism might work diligently but be racked with anxiety, while someone who scores high in openness and agreeableness would likely do well in a job that requires adaptability and empathy, like a human resources manager, for example. Finally, no matter what type of story you are trying to tell, if you want to create a character who is realistically flawed, make sure they're as prone to misunderstanding others as real people are. Researchers suggest that we read the emotions and thoughts of those closest to us with an accuracy of only 35%. That leads to a lot of mutual misunderstandings, and in fiction, as in real life, those misunderstandings are the source of a lot of drama. One of the most famous misunderstandings in literature is in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, when Juliet's father thinks that she is sad because her cousin Tybalt has been killed by Romeo. In this moment, he misunderstands her grief, as she is actually sad that Romeo has been sent into exile from Verona for killing Tybalt. In response to her sadness, he organizes for Juliet to marry Count Paris. This misunderstanding sets in motion the drama of the play, which ends in both Romeo and Juliet killing themselves. A good story should always make us wonder who the character really is. This is the question that keeps us reading or watching, and it comes from our desire to fully understand the mind of others. But how do we determine what kind of person a character is? The answer is to put them in specific situations to reveal their character. Specific situations help us answer the question at the heart of understanding people. Is this character selfless or selfish? This question can be traced back thousands of years to tribal gossip, where language first evolved. Even today, studies show that gossip is about 2/3 of our conversations. The majority of that time is spent discussing how others have selfishly broken the moral rules of our group, rather than being considerate enough to follow the rules. Whether it's gossip about a friend's bad behavior, or the story from the Bible of Eve taking the apple from the tree, a good story reveals to us whether or not a character thinks of others and is selfless, or thinks of himself and is selfish. Another way to show who the character really is through unexpected changes that test the beliefs they have had for most of their lives. Storr gives the example of the titular character in the film The Truman Show. In this film, Truman believes he is living a normal life in a normal town, but he has actually been the subject of a reality TV show his entire life. As the story begins, unusual events begin to make it clear that his life isn't what he thought. Changes in a character's world can have a big effect on a character. As Truman's belief system is slowly being destroyed, he starts acting unpredictably as his sense of who he really is changes. As a result, we no longer know who he is. We watch each new strange event in his life and we wonder, is he going to ignore all of this and pretend like everything is normal? Or will he try to discover what's really happening? All we know is that he is no longer the Truman from the start of the movie, and we have to watch in order to find out how these unexpected changes will change him. There's a reason we remember the small details a long time after we finish a story. Our brains want to fill in gaps in information, especially as they gain more knowledge. Researchers carried out a study in which some participants were shown 3 pictures of a person's body parts, while other groups were shown just 2 pictures and others only 1. The researchers found that the more pictures the participants saw, the more that they wanted to see a picture of the whole person. You can excite the brain's curiosity by giving it just enough information, and this is a tool which storytellers use to keep people interested in their plots and characters. One way to reveal information about a character is through dialogue. Good dialogue works on 2 levels, offering plot-developing information as well as telling your audience something about the character's background, personality, and emotions. Take the film Brokeback Mountain, in which 2 cowboys, Jack and Ennis, start a secret love affair while working together in the mountains. During a particularly tense moment, Jack tells Ennis, "I wish I knew how to quit you." The line says one thing outwardly, and if we only focus on the words that Jack says, on the surface it is a simple statement about their relationship. But underneath those words, there is a lot of tension, restraint, and yearning. Descriptions of characters' environments can also show the difference between how characters present themselves and who they really are underneath. A room with a punk band poster on the wall tells us something about who our character is outwardly, the person that this character wants others to see them as. More private items like receipts for embarrassing purchases or an old photograph in a wallet tell us something about who they are on the inside. The more vulnerable person they maybe want to keep hidden from others. Offering these scenes without commentary lets readers guess who this character really is and reach their own conclusions about the character. This isn't to say you should avoid descriptions. Poetic descriptions cause a frenzy of activity in our brains. This is why our experience of something is greatly influenced by how it is described. Metaphors are one of our favorite types of description. A metaphor is a figurative expression in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. For example, we can say that a very kind person who always tries to help other people has a heart of gold. Of course, we don't mean that their heart is literally made of gold, but the expression, the metaphor, gives us a strong impression of who this person is. In stories, metaphors evoke powerful associations that create a more vivid experience for your audience. In one study, some participants read the phrase, "He had a rough day," while some read, "He had a bad day." Those who read the rough day phrase had brain scans that showed neural activity in regions of the brain associated with feeling textures. So we've uncovered all the elements of a great story, but what type of story will keep people hooked until the very end? The animal world is fueled by status. That is, who is at the top, who is at the bottom, and how they rise or fall. Crickets, a kind of insect, keep a running total of wins versus losses against their enemies. Depending on their win-to-loss ratio, they can evaluate how high or how low they are within their society. Chimpanzees keep an eye on their leader, always looking for signs that they may need to be replaced. And humans are no different. While our ambition to understand other humans reflects our desire to get along and to have a good relationship with others, we have another deeply ingrained need: achieving status and a higher position in our society or community. Researchers have observed that people's physical and mental well-being seem to depend on the status given to them by others. However, our need for status often clashes with the pressure to act selflessly, creating drama and conflict. Our desire for status gives us a concrete goal to work toward. If the brain is our narrator, goal direction is what keeps our story's plot moving forward. This was shown in a study where restaurant employees were asked to choose all possible futures they might have from a list, as well as the ones their co-workers might have. They overwhelmingly predicted brighter, better futures for themselves than for their co-workers. Just as we enjoy working towards our own goals, we also like to feel like a participant in a character's struggle towards a goal. In our goal-based struggle, we all see ourselves as the underdog, the character who has to fight to reach their goal. We are tiny David against the mighty, powerful giant Goliath. Since we identify with those with lower status, we support them and wish to see those with higher status put in their place, defeated, and made humble. In one study conducted by researchers at Shenzhen University in China, participants played a computer game. After playing for a while, they were told they had achieved 2-star player status. When the researchers then showed them pictures of 1-star and 3-star players in pain, brain scans showed they only really experienced empathy for the 1-star players. Even when the only difference in status between the two groups was how well they played a video game, we still feel more connected to the underdog, the person with lower status. Change in status can also lead to the breaking down of deeply held beliefs, which is at the heart of an interesting story. For example, in Shakespeare's play King Lear, the king asks his 3 daughters to show their love for him in order to determine how to divide his land. 2 of his daughters praise him in great detail, gushing over their love for him, all the while plotting to take his power, and they eventually succeed. The removal of his status as all-powerful king by his own daughters shatters his previously held belief that everyone acts in his best interest. The destruction of his belief that everyone thinks about him before themselves drives his actions throughout the play as he descends into madness. When we think of propaganda, we may recall posters calling for war recruitment or movies that show political rivals as enemies. We may consider it false or deliberately inaccurate information used to promote a political cause or point of view. But in a sense, most stories, from children's books to best-selling thrillers, are a form of propaganda. They teach us lessons about the right ways to behave and contain warnings for what happens when we don't do what the society at the time has decided is right. Stories teach us lessons about ways to gain and secure our status as individuals. This is most easily recognized in religious texts and childhood stories. For example, in the children's book Mr. Nosy. To be nosy means to have excessive interest in the lives of other people. In the book, the character of Mr. Nosy is repeatedly punished for his nosy behavior until he stops and is eventually welcomed back into the community as someone who now respects the privacy of others. What about when not just our individual status, but the status of our group feels threatened? We resort to stories to tap into the primal urge to maintain it. The infamous 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, spread vicious ideas about the threat that Black Americans posed to the so-called white race. This insidious message resulted in many joining the Ku Klux Klan and increased the violence and hatred already experienced by black people. On the other hand, stories can also give us the ability to empathize with characters by transporting us into their brains. If you've ever missed your stop on the bus because you were completely engrossed in a story, you've experienced what psychologists call transportation. Research shows that when we are in this state, our attitudes and beliefs are more susceptible to change. For example, in the United States, autobiographical stories by former slaves, such as the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, helped change white people's attitudes about slavery. The power of stories lies in these experiences of losing one's self. They become a journey in discovering things about ourselves, each other, and the world that we share. The human brain is drawn to stories about how flawed characters react and adapt to unexpected change. A good story starts with a character with flawed beliefs about how to control their environment and achieve their goals, then sets up obstacles that will test those beliefs and encourage the reader to ask, who is this character? Adding elements like information gaps, poetic language rich in metaphor, and a theme of status change stimulates the brain further, keeping the audience hooked and eager to learn more. Whether you want to create and tell your own stories or want to understand why certain characters and stories are more interesting and more captivating than others, Will Storr's book, The Science of Storytelling, is a great book for understanding how stories work. It will not only give you the tools to understand why you enjoy certain kinds of books or movies over others, but it will also increase your ability to recognize stories in the real world. Either the story that your brain tells you in order to create meaning from a meaningless situation, or the stories that other people try to use to control you. Whether that is an advertisement trying to convince you to buy their product, or someone who is trying to manipulate your fears for their political goals. Okay, we have come to the end of the podcast. I hope that you were interested in the science of storytelling and that you have learned something new. Maybe something that you would like to talk about with your friends or family, and maybe even talk about it with them in English if you have the opportunity. If you check my Instagram post announcing the release of this podcast, you will find some questions to help you begin a conversation, or which you can use as writing practice by writing your opinion in the comments. As I said before, I encourage you to listen to this podcast a few times. The more times that you listen, the more that you will understand. And to help, you can also find the transcript of everything I have said on my website, justconnectenglish.com. But thank you very much for listening to this podcast. I hope that it is helping you to learn English in a different, more interesting way. If you would like to continue learning any part of the English language, you can book a class with me through my website. Again, that's justconnectenglish.com. The podcast will be back next Tuesday with another interesting topic. Next week, we will be looking at social media and whether or not you should delete it. In the meantime, try to practice a little bit of English every day, even if it's just a few minutes here and there, and I'll see you soon.